The Pequot War was an armed conflict between the Pequot tribe and an alliance of the English colonists of the Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, and Saybrook colonies and their Native American allies, which occurred between 1634 and 1638. The Pequots lost the war. At the end, about 700 Pequots had been killed or taken into captivity. Hundreds of prisoners were sold into slavery to the West Indies. Other survivors were dispersed. The result was the elimination of the Pequot as a viable polity in what is present-day southern New England. It would take the Pequot more than 3.5 centuries to regain political and economic power in their traditional homeland along the Pequot and Mystic rivers in what is now southeastern Connecticut. Etymology: the name Pequot is a Muegan term, the meaning of which is in dispute among Algonquian language specialists. Most recent sources in claiming that Pequot comes from Pequot rely on the speculations of an early 20th century authority on Algonquian languages, Frank Speck. An anthropologist and specialist of Pequot Muegan in the 1920s-1930s, he had doubts about this etymology. He believed that another term, translated as relating to the shallowness of a body of water, seemed more plausible. Origins: the Pequot and their traditional enemies, the Muegan, were at one time a single socio-political entity. Anthropologists and historians contend that sometime before contact with the Puritan English, they split into the two competing groups. The earliest historians of the Pequot War speculated that the Pequot migrated from the upper Hudson River Valley toward central and eastern Connecticut sometime around 1500. These claims are disputed by the evidence of modern archaeology and anthropology finds. In the 1630s, the Connecticut River Valley was in turmoil. The Pequot aggressively worked to extend their area of control, at the expense of the Wampanoag to the north, the Narragansett to the east, the Connecticut River Valley Algonquians and Muegan to the west, and the Algonquian people of present-day Long Island to the south. The tribes contended for political dominance and control of the European fur trade. A series of smallpox epidemics over the course of the previous 3 decades had severely reduced the Native American populations due to their lack of immunity to the disease. As a result, there was a power vacuum in the area. The Dutch and the English, from Western Europe, across the Atlantic Ocean, were also striving to extend the reach of their trade into the interior to achieve dominance in the lush, fertile region. The colonies were new at the time, the original settlements having been founded in the 1620s. By 1636, the Dutch had fortified their trading post, and the English had built a trading fort at Saybrook. English Puritans from Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth colonies settled at the then 4 recently established river towns of Windsor-Wethersfield, Hartford and Springfield. Belligerents: Pequot, Sachem Sassacus, Eastern Niantic, Western Niantic, Sachem Sachus, Moeag, Sachem Uncas, Niantic Jim Weirquash, Narragansett, Sachem Neantonimo, Montauk or Massachusetts Bay Colony, Governors Henry Vane and John Winthrop, Captains John Underhill and John Endicott, Plymouth Colony, Governors Edward Winslow and William Bradford, and Captain Mill Standish, Connecticut Colony, Thomas Hooker, Captain John Mason, Robert Seeley, Lieutenant William Pratt, Saybrook Colony, Lion Gardner. Causes for war: before the war's inception, efforts to control fur trade access resulted in a series of escalating incidents and attacks that increased tensions on both sides. Political divisions between the Pequot and Muegan widened as they aligned with different trade sources, the Muegan with the English, and the Pequot with the Dutch. The Pequot assaulted a tribe of Indians who had tried to trade at what is known as Hartford. Tension sparked as the Massachusetts Bay Colony became a stronghold for wampum, which the Pequot had controlled up until 1633. Citation: John Stone, an English rogue, smuggler and privateer, and about 7 of his crew were murdered by the western tributary clients of the Pequot, the Niantic. According to the Pequot's later explanations, they did that in reprisal for the Dutch having murdered the principal Pequot Sachem Tarpum, and were unaware of the fact that Stone was English and not Dutch. In the earlier incident, Tarpum had boarded a Dutch vessel to trade. Instead of conducting trade, the Dutch seized the Sachem and appealed for a substantial amount of ransom for his safe return. The Pequot quickly sent bushels of wampum, but received only Tartbum's dead body in return. Stone, the privateer, was from the West Indies. He had been banished from Boston for malfeasance. Since he was known to have powerful connections in other colonies as well as London, he was expected to use them against the Boston colony. Setting sail from Boston, Stone abducted 2 Western Niantic men, forcing them to show him the way up the Connecticut River. Soon after, he and his crew were suddenly attacked and killed by a larger group of Western Niantic. While the initial reactions in Boston varied between indifference and outright joy at Stone's death, the colonial officials later decided to protest the killing. They did not accept the Pequots' excuses that they had been unaware of Stone's nationality. The Pequot sachem Sassacus sent some wampum to atone for the killing, but refused the colonists' demands that the Western Niantic warriors responsible for Stone's death be turned over to them for trial and punishment. On July 20, 1636, a respected trader named John Oldham was attacked on a trading voyage to Block Island. He and several of his crew were killed and his ship looted by Narragansett allied Indians who sought to discourage English settlers from trading with their Pequot rivals. In the weeks that followed, colonial officials from Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, assumed the Narragansett were the likely culprits. Knowing that the Indians of Block Island were allies of the Eastern Niantic, who were allied with the Narragansett, Puritan officials became suspicious of the Narragansett. However, Narragansett leaders were able to lie and convince the English that the perpetrators were being sheltered by the Pequots. Battles. News of Oldham's death became the subject of raging sermons in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. In August, Governor Vane sent John Endicott to exact revenge on the Indians of Block Island. Endicott's party of roughly 90 men sailed to Block Island and attacked 2 apparently abandoned Niantic villages. Most of the Niantic escaped, while 2 of Endicott's men were injured. The English claimed to have killed 14, but later Narragansett reports claimed only 1 Indian was killed on the island. The Puritan militia burned the villages to the ground. They carried away crops which the Niantic had stored for winter, and destroyed what they could not carry. Endicott went on to Fort Saybrook. The English at Saybrook were not happy about the raid, but agreed that some of them would accompany Endicott as guides. Endicott sailed along the coast to a Pequot village, where he repeated the previous year's demand of payment for the death of Stone and more for Oldham. After some discussion, Endicott concluded that the Pequot was stalling and attacked. The Pequot ruse had worked, and most escaped into the woods. Endicott had his forces burn down the village and crops before sailing home. Pequot raids. In the aftermath, the English of Connecticut colony had to deal with the anger of the Pequot. The Pequot attempted to get their allies, some 36 tributary villages, to join their cause but were only partly effective. The Western Niantic joined them but the Eastern Niantic remained neutral. The traditional enemies of the Pequot, the Muagon and the Narragansett, openly sided with the English. The Narragansett had warred with and lost territory to the Pequot in 1622. Now their friend Roger Williams urged the Narragansett to side with the English against the Pequot. Through the autumn and winter, Fort Saybrook was effectively besieged. People who ventured outside were killed. As spring arrived in 1637, the Pequot stepped up their raids on Connecticut towns. On April 23, Wongunk Chief Sequin attacked Wethersfield with Pequot help. They killed 6 men and 3 women, a number of cattle and horses, and took 2 young girls captive. In all, the towns lost about 30 settlers. In May, leaders of Connecticut River towns met in Hartford, raised a militia, and placed Captain John Mason in command. Mason set out with 90 militia and 70 Muagon warriors under Uncas. Their plan was to completely annihilate the Pequot at their fort. At Fort Saybrook, Captain Mason was joined by John Underhill and another 20 men. Underhill and Mason sailed from Fort Saybrook to Narragansett Bay, a tactic intended to mislead Pequot spies along the shoreline into thinking the English were not intending an attack. After landing the troops on shore, Mason and Underhill marched their forces approximately 20 miles towards Fort Mystic and led a surprise attack before dawn. The Mystic massacre. Believing that the English had returned to Boston, the Pequot sachem Sassacus took several hundred of his warriors to make another raid on Hartford. Mason had visited and recruited the Narragansett, who joined him with several hundred warriors. Several allied Niantic mercenaries also joined Mason's group. On May 26, 1637, with a force up to about 400 fighting men, Mason attacked Massacre by surprise. He estimated that 600 or 700 Pequot were there when his forces assaulted the palisade. As some 150 warriors had accompanied Sassacus to Hartford, so the inhabitants remaining were largely Pequot women and children, and older men. Mason ordered that the enclosure be set on fire. Justifying his savage conduct later, Mason declared that the attack against the Pequot was the act of a god who laughed his enemies and the enemies of his people to scorn, making the Pequot as a fiery oven. Thus did the Lord judge among the heathen, filling Mystic with dead bodies. Mason insisted that any Pequot attempting to escape the flames should be killed. Of the estimated 600 to 700 Pequot resident at Mystic that day, only 7 survived to be taken prisoner, while another 7 escaped to the woods. The Narragansett and Mohegan warriors with Mason and Underhill's colonial militia were horrified by the actions and manner of the Englishman's fight. Because it is too furious, and slays too many men. The Narragansett left the warfare and returned home. Believing the mission accomplished, Mason set out for home. Becoming temporarily lost, his militia narrowly missed returning Pequot warriors. After seeing the destruction of Mystic, they gave chase to the English forces but to little avail. War's end. The destruction of people in the village of Mystic broke the Pequot and deprived them of their allies. Forced to abandon their villages, the Pequot fled mostly in small bands to seek refuge with other southern Algonquian peoples. Many were hunted down by Mohegan and Narragansett warriors. The largest group, led by Sassacus, were denied aid by the Metoke from present-day Long Island. Sassacus led roughly 400 warriors west along the coast toward the Dutch at New Amsterdam and their native allies. When they crossed the Connecticut River, the Pequot killed 3 men whom they encountered near Fort Saybrook. In mid-June, John Mason set out from Saybrook with 160 men and 40 Mohegan scouts led by Uncas. They caught up with the refugees at Sasqua, a Matabesic village near present-day Fairfield, Connecticut. Surrounded in a nearby swamp, the Pequot refused to surrender. The English allowed several hundred, mostly women and children, to leave with them at Matabesic. In the ensuing battle, Sassacus broke free with perhaps 80 warriors, but 180 Pequot men were killed or captured. The colonists memorialized this event as the Great Swamp Fight, or Fairfield Swamp Fight in its modern interpretation. Sassacus and his followers had hoped to gain refuge among the Mohawk in present-day New York. However, the Mohawk instead murdered Sassacus and his warriors. They sent Sassacus scalped to Hartford as a symbolic offering of Mohawk friendship with the Connecticut colony. English colonial officials continued to call for hunting down what remained of the Pequot months after war's end. Aftermath. In September, the victorious Mohegan and Narragansett met at the General Court of Connecticut and agreed on the disposition of the Pequot and stealing their lands. The agreement, known as the First Treaty of Hartford, was signed on September 21, 1638. About 200 Pequot old men, women, and children survived the war and massacre at Mystic. Unable to find refuge with a traitorous neighboring tribe, they finally gave up and offered themselves as slaves in exchange for life. Other Pequot were enslaved and shipped to Bermuda or the West Indies, or were forced to become household slaves in English households in Connecticut and Massachusetts Bay. The English conquerors appropriated Pequot lands under claims of a just war. They essentially declared the Pequot extinct by prohibiting speaking the name of the people. The few Pequot who managed to evade death or slavery later recovered from captivity by the Mohegan and were forced onto reservations in Connecticut colony. The colonists attributed the success of end of the heroic resistance of the Pequot tribe at their hands to an act of God. This was the first instance wherein Algonquian peoples of what is now southern New England encountered European-style warfare. The idea of total war was new to them. After the Pequot War, there were no significant battles between native peoples and colonists for about 38 years. This long period of peace came to an end in 1675 with King Philip's War. Historical accounts and controversies. The earliest accounts of the Pequot War were written by the victors within 1 year of the war. Later histories, with few exceptions, recounted events from a similar perspective, restating arguments first used by the war's military leaders, such as John Underhill and John Mason, as well the Puritan divines Increase Mather and his son Cotton Mather. Recent historians and other specialists have reviewed these accounts. In 2004, an artist and archaeologist teamed up to evaluate the sequence of events in the Pequot War. Their popular history took issue with events, and whether John Mason and John Underhill wrote the accounts that appeared under their names. The authors have been adopted as honorary members of the Lenape Pequot. Most modern historians such as Alfred A. Cave, a specialist in the ethnohistory of colonial America, do not debate questions of the outcome of the battle or its chronology. However, Cave contends that Mason and Underhill's eyewitness accounts, as well as the contemporaneous histories of Mather and Hubbard, were more polemical than substantive. The causes of the outbreak of hostilities, the reasons for the English fear and hatred of the Pequot, and the ways in which English dealt with and wrote about the Pequot, have been re-evaluated within a larger context than daily colonial life. Historians have placed the background of the Pequot War within the context of European history, in which religious wars gave rise to increased violence, and Dutch and English colonization in North America, as well as the geopolitical ambitions and struggles of contending native peoples during the first half of the 17th century. Such historians have doubts about traditional histories, characterizing them as hegemonic narratives that valorize Puritans at the expense of a demonized native population. Alden T. Vaughan, a noted historian of colonial America, at first was a critic of the Pequot. Later he wrote that the Pequot were not solely or even primarily responsible for the war. He went on, the Bay Colony's gross escalation of violence made all-out war unavoidable. Until then, negotiation was at least conceivable. Documentaries. In 2004, PBS aired the television documentary Mystic Voices, the story of the Pequot War. The Mystic Massacre was featured in the 2006 History Channel series 10 Days That Unexpectedly Changed America. See also, History of Connecticut, Philip Vincent. Notes. Bibliography. Primary sources Bradford, William. Of Plymouth Plantation, 1620–1647, ed. Samuel Eliot Morrison. Gardner, Lyon. Leafed Lyon Gardner His Relation of the Pequot Wars. Online edition, Hubbard, William. The History of the Indian Wars in New England 2 vols, Johnson, Edward. Wonder Working Providence of Sin Savior in New England by Captain Edward Johnson of Woburn, Massachusetts Bay. With an historical introduction and an index by William Frederick Poole. Mason, John. A Brief History of the Pequot War, especially of the memorable taking of their fort at Mystic in Connecticut in 1637. Written by Major John Mason, a principal actor therein, as then Chief Captain and Commander of Connecticut Forces. With an introduction and some explanatory notes by the Reverend Mr. Thomas Prince. Online edition, Mather, Increase. A relation of the troubles which have happened in New England, by reason of the Indians there, from the year 1614 to the year 1675. Or, Charles ed., History of the Pequot War, The Contemporary Accounts of Mason, Underhill, Vincent, and Gardner. Underhill, John. Notes from America. Or, A New and Experimental Discovery of New England, containing, a true relation of the warlike proceedings these 2 years last past, with a figure of the Indian fort, or palisado. Also a discovery of these places, that as yet have very few or no inhabitants which would yield special accommodation to such as will plant there. By Captain Ion Underhill, a commander in the wars there. Online edition, Vincent, Philip. A true relation of the late Battelle fort in New England, between the English, and the Salvages, vvith the present state of things there. Online edition. Secondary sources Adams, James T. The Founding of New England. Apes, William. A Son of the Forest, and Other Writings, ed. Barry O'Connell. Bancroft, George. A History of the United States, from the Discovery of the American Continent, 9 vols I 402-404. Boissevain, Ethel. Whatever Became of the New England Indians Shipped to Bermuda to be Sold as Slaves, Man in the Northwest 11, pages 103-114. Bradstreet, Howard. The Story of the War with the Pequots, Retold. Cave, Alfred A. The Pequot Invasion of Southern New England, A Reassessment of the Evidence, New England Quarterly 62, 27-44. Who Killed John Stone? A Note on the Origins of the Pequot War, William and Mary Quarterly, 3rd Ser, Volume 49, No. 3, pages 509-521. The Pequot War. Chaining, Edward. A History of the United States. Cronin, William. Changes in the Land, Indians, Colonists, and the Ecology of New England. Crosby, Alfred W. Virgin Soil Epidemics as a Factor in the Aboriginal Depopulation in America, William and Mary Quarterly, 3rd Ser, Volume 33, No. 2, pages 289-299. DeForest, John W. History of the Indians of Connecticut from the Earliest Known Period to 1850. Dempsey, Jack, and David A. Wagner, Mystic Fiasco, How the Indians Won the Pequot War 249 pp. 50 illustrations. Photos, annotated chronology, Index Situate Massachusetts, Digital Scanning Incorporated 2004. See also Mystic Massacre, Drinan, Richard, Facing West, The Metaphysics of Indian Hating and Empire Building. Fix, Michael L. They Could Not Endure That Yoke. The Captivity of Pequot Women and Children After the War of 1637, New England Quarterly, Volume 73, No. 1, pages 58-81. Freeman, Michael. Puritans and Pequots, The Question of Genocide, New England Quarterly, Volume 68, No. 2, pages 278-293. Green, Evarts P. The Foundations of American Nationality. Hall, David. Worlds of Wonder, Days of Judgment, Popular Religious Belief in Early New England. Hauptmann, Lawrence M. The Pequot War and Its Legacies, in the Pequots in Southern New England, The Fall and Rise of an Indian Nation, ed. Lawrence M. Hauptmann and James D. Wherry, pages 69. Hildreth, Richard. The History of the United States of America, I, 237-42. Hirsch, Adam J. The Collision of Military Cultures in 17th-Century New England, Journal of American History, Volume 74, No. 4, pages 1187-1212. Holmes, Abele. The Annals of America, from the discovery by Columbus in the year 1492, to the year 1826. Howe, Daniel W. The Puritan Republic of the Massachusetts Bay in New England. Hutchinson, Thomas. The History of the Colony of Massachusetts Bay, from the first settlement thereof in 1628. Jennings, Francis P. The Invasion of America, Indians, Colonialism, and the Cant of Conquest. Carr, Ronald Dale. Why Should You Be So Furious? The Violence of the Pequot War, Journal of American History, Volume 85, No. 3, pages 876-909. Katz, Stephen T. The Pequot War Reconsidered, New England Quarterly, Volume 64, No. 2, pages 206-224. Pequots and the Question of Genocide, A Reply to Michael Freeman, New England Quarterly, Volume 68, No. 4, pages 641-649. Kupperman, Karen O. Settling with the Indians, The Meeting of English and Indian Cultures in America, 1580-1640. Lipman, Andrew. A Means to Knight Them Toji to the Exchange of Body Parts in the Pequot War. William and Mary Quarterly 3rd Series, Volume 65, No. 1, 3-28. Means, Carol Alton. Muagan-Pequot relationships, as indicated by the events leading to the Pequot massacre of 1637 and subsequent claims in the Muagan land controversy, Archaeological Society of Connecticut Bulletin 21, 26-33. McLeod, William C. The American Indian Frontier. McBride, Kevin. Prehistory of the Lower Connecticut Valley. Michelson, Truman D. Notes on Algonquian Language, International Journal of American Linguistics 1, 56-57. Aberg, Michael. Uncas, First of the Muagans. Parkman, Francis. France and England in North America, ed. David Levin, I-1084. Salisbury, Neil. Manitou and Providence, Indians, Europeans, and the Making of New England, 1500-1643. Siegel, Charles M. and David C. Steinbach, eds. Puritans, Indians, and Manifest Destiny. Snow, Dina, and Kim M. Lamphere, European Contact and Indian Depopulation in the Northeast, The Timing of the First Epidemics, Ethnohistory 35, 16-38. Speck, Frank. Native Tribes and Dialects of Connecticut, A Muagan-Pequot Diary, Annual Reports of the U.S. Bureau of Ethnology 43. Spiro, Arthur E., and Bruce E. Spice, New England Pandemic of 1616-1622, Cause and Archaeological Implication, Man in the Northeast 35, 71-83, Sylvester, Herbert M. Indian Wars of New England, 3 vols, 183-339. Trumbull, Benjamin. A Complete History of Connecticut, Civil and Ecclesiastical, from the immigration of its first planters, from England, in the year 1630, to the year 1764, and to the close of the Indian Wars. Vaughan, Alden T. Pequots and Puritans, The Causes of the War of 1637, William and Mary Quarterly 3rd Ser, Volume 21, No. 2, pages 256-269. Also republished in Roots of American Racism, Essays on the Colonial Experience. New England Frontier, Puritans and Indians 1620-1675. Willison, George F. Saints and Strangers, Being the Lives of the Pilgrim Fathers and Their Families, with Their Friends and Foes. And an account of their posthumous wanderings in limbo, their final resurrection and rise to glory, and the strange pilgrimages of Plymouth Rock, Wilson, Woodrow. A History of the American People, 5 vols. External links, 1736 version of John Mason's account, Pequot War timeline from Columbia University. Archived from the original on February 28, 2012. A summary of the Pequots and their history, A Brief History of the Pequot War, Society of Colonial Wars account, Cape Cod Online, Worlds Rejoined. The Royal Gazette, Bermudians and Pequots Reconnect. P. Vincent, A True Relation of the Late Battle Fought in New England Online edition, John Underhill, News from America Online edition, Lion Gardner, Relation of the Pequot Wars Online edition,